It's good to see you this morning. My name is Hunter, and I'm one of the pastors here. It is great to have you with us this morning. And if you are new, hope to meet some of you at the brunch after the service. To get there, you are on the second floor now, and it is one floor up. So take any stairs you find, and then it's in the room. There's a coffee room back here. It's right above that, and we'll have brunch and some folks in there to greet you right after the service. So hope to meet some of you. We're going to begin a time of teaching, and it'll help you if you have a Bible. It'll help you to follow along. We're going to be in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, verse 8, 9, and 10. Romans 13, 8, 9, and 10. And if you don't have a Bible with you, there are several ways you can get one. There's some paperback ones down the ends of your row, and you can have someone slide that down to you and locate the book of Romans. If you need to consult the table of contents, that is fine. Or there are many copies of the Bible floating around in the sky. And if you just Google Romans chapter 13, it will just pop it onto the screen of your smartphone. And if you are looking at your phone, we just assume that you are definitely reading the Bible. That's just what we assume here. So that will be two ways to get there. And you'll find the book of Romans in the New Testament right after the four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John are all about the life and the teaching and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And then there's a book called Acts, which is about how the Jesus movement was born in Jerusalem and how it just expanded throughout the Greco-Roman world in the first century. And then there's a long series of letters that were written to many of the early churches. And the first one we have listed is a letter written by Paul the Apostle to the church at Rome, therefore titled creatively Romans. This book is very exhaustive. We've been going through it for several months now, and in this letter, Paul, more than anywhere else in the Bible, he just exhaustively lays out what it looks like to believe in Jesus. He explains in great depth what Jesus did through his death and resurrection and what it means to have faith in him. And then he says, if you have faith in Jesus, you are united. You're joined to Jesus by your faith. You are joined to him in such a way that you are in a living union. This is his language. You're in a living union with him such that what is his flows to you. And so he just unpacks all the things that flow to you if you are united to Jesus. He does that in the first 11 chapters of Romans, and then in chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15, he just explains how if you're united to Jesus and have received all of these gifts of grace, how it then impacts various aspects of your life. And so in the second part of this letter, we're just calling it the gospel in real life, because it's all about how the gospel of Jesus comes and affects the real nitty-gritty areas of your life. And then he concludes the letter in chapter 16 by saying hi to lots of people. And we will not spend too much time there when we make it there in a few weeks. So that's where we are, Romans chapter 13. And today we're just going to look at three verses, 8, 9, and 10. And we're going to look at a passage that is going to challenge the way that many of us follow Jesus. Or you could say it like this. Paul is going to teach us something today that Jesus taught. In fact, there is a lot of parallel between what Paul is going to teach us today and what Jesus taught. And in order to get this thing that Jesus taught that Paul is now passing on to us, we're going to have to deal straight on with one of the most widespread misunderstandings in American Christianity. Many of us have bought into a belief and are living out that belief in a way that simply doesn't square with the teaching of Jesus, nor with what Paul is going to teach us in Romans 13 today. And so this is going to be a little bit challenging for you. It could be potentially disorienting at first, but before you tense up too much, let me diffuse a little bit of the anxiety. Once we see the mistaken belief and the mistaken way of living that we often buy into as a result, and then we compare it to what Paul is going to teach us today, I guarantee you'll say, yeah, Jesus' way and Paul's way is better. You're not going to read this and think that this sucks. You're going to like this. So what we're going to learn today is going to be far more life-giving and joy-producing than the mistaken belief that many of us have bought into. And in fact, some of us have just experienced enormous pain because someone used this mistaken belief in a relationship we were in. Some have been in a relationship where someone used this common misunderstanding to justify something they did to us. Some of us have used this to harm others, and in the quietness of our soul, we regret what we did with that. This mistaken belief is responsible for broken marriages and unhealthy churches and lost friendships and toxic communities. But what Paul is going to teach us today has the power to heal all of that. And when you hear it, you're going to want it. Or if you don't want to do it, you're at least going to hope that everyone you're in relationship does this for you. And the good news for us is that the gospel of Jesus comes into our lives and makes this thing that Paul is going to tell us to do, it makes it possible for us. So first we're going to have to understand a little bit of our commonly mistaken belief, and then we'll set it right beside what Paul is going to teach us today in Romans 13. So what is this mistaken belief I keep referring to? It goes something like this. We will tend to think, through Jesus, God has given me grace, and that's true. We learned that in Romans. And I didn't have to do anything to earn grace. So far, so good. And this grace will never run out. That's also true. You can never get out of it. And now, since God's given me grace, I didn't have to earn it, it'll never run out. I don't have to obey any kind of law or commands. We learned in Romans that grace comes to us through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And grace, by definition, means you get it as a gift, not by earning it. And we learned it'll never run out, that once you get in, you can't get out. There's always abounding grace. Paul says you've been ushered into a state of grace where grace reigns like a dictator. It's a good dictator to live under. But if that's true, we'll say if that's true, and if you've received this grace, then you don't have to obey any kind of law or command. Now, is that right? That's what many of us have been led to believe. Now, here's how that then flows down and affects real life for us. Many of us live with a functional ethic. An ethic is just a code of life or an ethos for living. Many of us live with a functional ethic that goes like this. If receiving grace means I don't have to obey any kind of law or command, then pretty much this is the way I live. I just do whatever I want to do. And afterwards, if it goes wrong, I say I'm sorry. You know, I need grace. I'm a messy person. Now, I call that a functional ethic because even if it doesn't sit quite right with you, that's how many of us functionally live. Last week, we looked at Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Paul said, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. But one of the applications of that is that I should follow the speed limit. That's my professed ethic of driving. Functionally, I often don't drive the speed limit. So your functional ethic is what you do most of the time. Whether it's what you would admit you want to do or think you should do, it's what you actually do most of the time, whether you would intellectually agree that it's the right thing or not. So functionally, many of us kind of fall into a pattern of living where if we're just honest with ourselves, we really just do most of the time whatever we want to do, and then we kind of cover it up with grace, and God loves messy people. So as long as I say I'm sorry and admit that I need grace, then everything's okay in the end. Now here's where it gets complicated, so you got to track carefully. A lot of the ingredients that go into that are absolutely true. So here's what's true. God does give you incredible, abundant, free grace through Jesus, and there's always more grace and there's always more mercy. So God does love messy people like us. You don't have to doubt that. When you fail, you can always go to grace. But here's the key question. Does God doing all of that for us mean we're no longer obligated to obey any kind of commands? Does it mean we're no longer obligated to strive for any particular way of living? Does God give us grace so that we can just do whatever we want to do and then say, well, I'm sorry, I'm messy? Or does he give us grace so we can have a different functional ethic that begins to work its way into our lives so that we actually live differently? Now, the first time that question got answered was way before the book of Romans, way back in the Old Testament in the book of Exodus. In fact, there's a pattern in Exodus that then just gets repeated in the New Testament. Noticing this pattern in Exodus will help you to understand what Paul is going to teach us today. Exodus is the first big picture we get in the Bible, in history, of what salvation looks like. In fact, it is the model of all salvation that God brings. It is the sometimes called the type, which means the picture, the imperfect picture of what God will eventually do through Jesus. So the Old Testament pattern in Exodus went like this. Israel was living in slavery in a land called Egypt. They were under the rule and reign of a brutal king called Pharaoh, and he was just working them and whipping them to death. And God saw this, and God said, I don't want my people to live under Pharaoh's reign any longer. I want them to live under my rule and my reign. Under Pharaoh, they were just being worked and whipped. But under me, God says, they're going to experience life. And so God calls a leader named Moses, and Moses leads them out of captivity in Egypt, and they set off for a new land where they're going to live under a good king. His name is God. And on the way to the new land to live under God's rule and reign, God stops them. He stops them and camps them out for 40 days, and he gives them his law. The core of it is what we call the Ten Commandments. Okay, so let me show you the 10 Commandments. Here's how they flowed. God spoke all these words, saying, I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now here come the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in the heaven above, or that's in the earth beneath, or that's in the water under the earth. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything else that is your neighbor's. That is the law. That's God's 10 Commandments found in Exodus chapter 20. Now, if you've ever taken time to read through those, you likely skipped right past the most important part. And the most important part came at the very beginning. So if you go back to the top, notice how God introduced all those commands. Before he even gave commands, notice how he introduced it. He said, God spoke all these words saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So notice the order. First, God redeemed his people. He brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery. First, God blessed his people. We might say first he saved his people. First he gave them grace. And then after he saved and redeemed and rescued and gave grace, then he gave commands. So commands followed salvation. Commands came after grace. So commands were not given to teach them how to earn grace or receive grace. God had already done all that. Commands and law were given to teach them how to respond to grace. Commands were given to teach free, rescued, redeemed people how to experience the fullness of life and freedom that God had purchased for them. So here's the pattern. After God saves people by grace, he gives them commands. So he did not intend their functional ethic to be, we've got grace, we've been rescued, so we'll do what we want. He intended their functional ethic to be, we'll obey his commands and experience life as a result. Now, if that's the pattern the first time God saved people, what do you think will happen when he brings a more perfect salvation, when he brings a more perfect Savior, when to usher his people into a more perfect eternal kingdom that will never end? Maybe he's going to give us a new functional ethic as a result of saving us by grace, just like he did with Israel. Maybe he's going to give us a new law to obey. Got the flow? Now you're ready for Romans chapter 13. Pick it up with me in verse 8. Paul starts like this. He goes, owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Owe no one anything except to love each other. At the end of the last paragraph, Paul instructed us to pay to all what is owed to them. Look at verse 7. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. Now he says something similar at the beginning of verse 8. Owe no one anything. Some interpret that as meaning a Christian should never be in debt for any reason whatsoever. I forgot to read the Dave Ramsey Study Bible this week to see if that's what this what this means. But that's not what it means. It means something like this. It means pay off your debts. Or it means keep your payments timely. So like many of you, I pay my bills at the first of every month. And apparently last month I forgot to pay the electric bill. And so I got a stern letter a couple of weeks ago that said past due. It had yellow lines at the top and the bottom. So owe no one anything means don't do what I did. It means keep your debts current. If you owe Excel Energy $75, pay them. If you owe the November payment on your mortgage, pay it. So owe no one anything except to love each other. What does that mean? It could mean that pay off all your debts except your love debt. It's okay to leave that one unpaid. You have to pay your student loans off, but it's okay not to love each other. But that can't be right because we're reading the Bible. And the Bible's not going to tell you not to love people, all right? Look, you should expect if you come to church, you're going to hear to love people. So that can't be right. It probably means something like this. It probably means you can and you should pay off all your other obligations, but you'll never pay this one off. One day your car will be paid off, and your mortgage will be paid off, and your student loans will be paid off if you live that long. But even when those are paid off and you owe no one anything, there will still be one exception. You will still owe love to each other. So love is an obligation. It's a debt you can never pay off. You'll always owe love. You will one day reach a point where you have paid enough to the mortgage company, where you have paid enough to the electric company, but you'll never reach a point where you have loved enough. You'll always owe love. So notice what's happening here. As a result of grace, we have been ushered into a never-ending obligation. Apparently, grace doesn't lead you into a functional ethic of do what I want and then say I'm sorry when I'm done. Apparently, it leads you into this. I always owe everyone love. Now watch how Paul continues. Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, or any other commandment, are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is why I told you the story of Israel and the Ten Commandments a few minutes ago. Because apparently love functions for people redeemed by Jesus the way law functioned for Israel after they'd been saved from Egypt. How did law function? It was not the way to receive redemption. It was a fitting and appropriate response to the redemption we had already received. It's a way to experience the fullness and the freedom of the life that God has given you and ushered you into. So how does love function? It's a fitting response to grace. It's the way to experience the fullness of life that God gives us in Christ. In fact, love fulfills the law, meaning love fulfills the purpose for which the law was given. The law was given to help free people experience life. And so all of the commandments are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's what they're all about. They're all about love. Now, the question some people ask in response to this is, okay, if all the commandments are summed up as love your neighbor as yourself, and if love is the fulfilling of the law, do we still need to learn and follow commands? As a Christian, what should your attitude be to the Ten Commandments? What should your attitude be to all the other commandments in the New Testament? Do you have to follow them? Do you have to learn them? Or is love, this ethic of love, is that all you need? Well, I think when it comes to the commands of God, there's probably two attitudes we need to be weary of. One attitude is the attitude that Jesus critiqued the Pharisees in his day for having. The Pharisees, you may or may not know, were the most precise, exacting, persnickety law keepers of their day. They memorized the commands. In fact, they had invented some 600 plus rules for how to keep the commands. But Jesus was not at all impressed with them. And here was his critique of them. This comes from Matthew chapter 23. He's gonna say woe to them a lot of times and call them hypocrites. He goes, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. You ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup, and the plate and the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. So the Pharisees outwardly kept the law, but inwardly they didn't love justice and mercy. Inwardly they were full of greed and self-indulgence and hypocrisy. In other words, they didn't love people. They kept the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law was love. Now, this can happen in religious communities. Religious communities can get concerned with behavior, right behavior, and correct doctrine, and great worship experiences and mission projects, but we don't love people. So that's one mistake you can make. It's having an external kind of law keeping without an inward principle of love in operation. Now, there's a second mistake. It's the opposite end of the spectrum. It's maybe the one that's more common in our day. And it would be to just love people. I just try to love people, but I don't really then worry about any of the specific commands that God gives. Now, here's the problem with that. The problem's the Bible. The New Testament repeats most of the commands of the Old Testament law in some form or fashion. In fact, the only command that isn't retaught in the New Testament is the Sabbath principle. And that's because Jesus has ushered us into a new Sabbath. But all the other 10 commandments are repeated in some form or fashion in the New Testament as the ethic for Jesus' followers. And so if you just read the New Testament, you'll find lots of specific commands and instructions. Now, why does God continue to give us commands and instructions, even though we know now the real point of all of that is love? He probably does that because we are imperfect lovers. And so if he just tells us to love each other, we won't be able to decipher what that actually means and looks like to love each other because we still wrestle with sin and confusion and brokenness. We're still messy people. So the commands help us by telling us what it looks like to love, and love is the intent of the command. So I think we need both. I think we need the specific, detailed commands of God. We need things like we heard in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, very specific command, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And we need to be reminded that the whole point of everything God ever instructs us to do as his people is to love each other. Now, what does it look like then to actually love each other? How would you learn to love people? Well, Paul told us. He tells us here what love does do, and then he tells us what love does not do. So pick it up in verse 9. He goes, the commandments, you shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. How many of us love to commit our lives in covenant to someone and then have them leave us for someone else? How many of us hope that when we die when someone wraps a rope around our neck and squeezes really hard so we can't breathe and strangles us? How many of us hope to log onto our bank account tomorrow morning and find that someone has cleaned us out? How many of you love it when someone is jealous of what you have and can't just be happy for you? None of us would want someone to commit adultery against us, or to murder us, or to steal something from us, or to covet what we have. That's the point. So this is how you learn to love. You ask, would I want someone to do the same thing to me if the situation was reversed? That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. And so adultery and murder and stealing and coveting are big and obvious examples, but you can apply this ethic to almost any situation. Maybe when right or wrong isn't even as obvious, like, is what I'm doing to this person, is that what I would want them to do to me if the roles were reversed? Jesus said it like this, Matthew chapter 7. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And so Paul says it like this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Any other commandment, it's all summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, here's the second principle about how to love, and it comes in verse 10. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Make sure that you hear this very carefully. The word wrong is a very, very precise word. It doesn't mean love never hurts anyone. It doesn't mean love never hands out any pain. If you love your children, sometimes you'll have to hurt them. Whether you are or are not a spanker, I'll leave that to your conscience. You better have some pain in your parental arsenal. You better, if you don't have some whoopings, you better have some timeouts and some groundings and some go to your rooms and some I'm taking away some privileges from you. I mean, you better hurt your kids from time to time. It'll hurt them and they will get so mad at you, and you are loving them so well. Last Sunday afternoon, I sat and watched a football game with one of my good friends. He has a particularly strong-willed son. And this son was begging and begging and begging him that he could wear his Halloween costume a day early or a few days early. And Dad knew that if he wore it, he would tear it up. And so he refused because he wanted his son to have a costume on Halloween. And the son got angrier and angrier and angrier. He accused the father of being mean. He accused the father of being boring. He said, "Dad, this is the most awful day ever. All we've done is go to church and watch this football game." And that dad held firm and eventually told him to be quiet. Loving his son well. We were suffering with that kid's nagging. So you have to suffer sometimes to love. Now, if you're a friend and you love your friend, you will have to say things to your friend from time to time that they would rather not hear. I hope you have friends like that. If you have a friend who has never questioned the wisdom of anything you do, you don't have a friend. You have a drinking buddy, you have a golfing buddy, you have a sister to get coffee with, you have a roommate, but you don't have a friend. I have a mentor who likes to say this. He goes, "I love you, so I'm going to hurt you." And that's how he prepares you to hear something about yourself that you'd rather not hear. And what he says is always life-giving and helpful and freeing and painful. So Proverbs chapter 27 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend." A good friend will wound you from time to time. So this does not mean love does no hurt. Some of you are so nice. You're not very loving. This does not say love does no hurt. It says love does no wrong to a neighbor. Wrong is hurt that doesn't heal and bring life. Wrong is hurt that brings destruction and confusion and lasting wounds. Wrong is something that causes someone unneeded, unnecessary pain and injury, something they have to recover from, and after they've recovered, they're not any better off for having gone through it. Wrong is when you don't say or do the necessary hard thing, and so by withholding your loving fatherly pain, you're allowing someone to continue in foolishness. That can be doing wrong to your neighbor as well. So here are two ways to love, and they both play off and enhance each other. First, love your neighbor as yourself. Would I want someone to do this to me? Would I want someone to do that for me? Secondly, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Is this good for them? Or will it injure them and hurt them unnecessarily? This is how you begin to cultivate a life of love. Now let's put our two functional ethics side by side. Many Christians, this is all we aspire to. I do what I want. I say I'm sorry when I mess up. There's forgiveness. There's grace. And functionally, we never change. We never become more like Jesus like that. We just cover over our foolishness and then do it again. That's the functional ethic that many of us live by. And now let's put this beside it. Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Which of those is more life-giving? Which of those is more beautiful? One will destroy friendships and relationships and marriages, all while covering it with grace. One will leave a trail of brokenness, all while covering it with grace. The other will preserve your friendships and enhance your friendships. The other will preserve your marriage and deepen your marriage. The other will preserve the community called the church and deepen and enhance the community called the church. So which of these is better? Which of these do you want? What would happen if we chose love? What would happen if we didn't settle for, oh, well, I'm messy. I'm so thankful there's grace. As good as that is, what would happen if that's what we had to fall back to from time to time? We all have to fall back to that. But what would happen if we pressed on and tried to become loving people like Paul is describing here? What would happen? Jesus told us what would happen. Here's what he told us in John chapter 13. He says, a new commandment. So Jesus, he's fixing to save his people. So he's going to give them some commandments to follow after he saves them so they can experience all the life that he purchased for them. So a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. So here's what Jesus says will happen if we cultivate this. It will be so uncommon that people will know it had to have come from him. So this is central. Our mission as a church is to see a movement of the gospel of Jesus that fills this city with disciples of Jesus. And by fills the city, we don't just mean that they move in and take over and kind of exist. We mean that they fill the city with the kind of life that Jesus cultivates for us. We mean that they fill the city with people who look and smell and act and feel like Jesus. And he says, if we do that, people will know you're my disciples because you have love for one another. Ultimately, the reason then that Jesus can tell us that we have an obligation, we have a debt that is so deep we'll just pay and pay and pay and pay and never pay it off. The reason he can tell us to love and love and love and love and love and love and love, and it'll never be finished. The reason he can tell us that, all your other debts, you will pay off one day. All your other debts you can satisfy. All your other debts you can write a check and take care of. Just get it in on time. The reason he can tell us that this is a debt that we can't pay, it's unlike any other debt that we have. The reason he can tell us that is because he has loved us in that way. And he will always love us in that way. And Jesus will never look at us and say, yep, I've loved them enough. I'm done loving them. Jesus will never look at us and say, yep, I have exhausted my love for them. And so I'm finished. Jesus will look at your sin and he will say, yep, I've paid all of that off. That's all been satisfied. But he'll never look at you and say, yep, I've loved you enough by now. If you haven't gotten it by now, I'm finished. I'm out of here. The reason he can tell you to always owe everyone love is that he always, always, always loves us and has demonstrated it to us by dying on the cross and continues to give it to us by providing life so that we can be people who become like him. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for your word, which challenges so much of what we settle for. And I pray that we would receive the challenge not as condemning, but as life-giving. I pray we would receive it in the same way your people, Israel, received your law, at least the way they received it at first. They received it with joy, knowing that the one who had rescued and the one who had redeemed and the one who had defeated Pharaoh on their behalf and had led them out of captivity to Egypt was a good God who would give them life. And so you gave commands that they might experience the fullness of joy of being your people. And now your son Jesus gives us a new law. Your son Jesus gives us a new command, and he gives it to us so that we might experience the joy of being your people. We might experience the life that he purchased for us, the life that he bought for us. We might experience more and more and more of what it means to be your people by learning to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so I pray that you would correct false notions of grace which we abuse to do what we want to do. I pray instead we would see grace as ushering us into a never-ending obligation. And we can be happy that it's a never-ending obligation because your son has entered into the same obligation to us by laying down his life for us, by justifying us, Paul says, by taking care of our debt of sin, by forgiving us. He has promised that he will never leave us or forsake us. He will never exhaust his love for us. And since he will never do that for us, we want to be able to do the same for others. Would you give us strength to do that? Would you give us grace to be that kind of people, that kind of community, that kind of church? Would you give us grace to be able to share that kind of love with our neighbors? Would you help many people see that we're disciples of your sons, not just because we talk about grace, but also because we love. We ask it in Jesus' name and by his Spirit. Amen.